All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Blackmore, and I am a learning coordinator with the Invasive Species Council of BC. ISCBC is a collaborative-based organization committed to reducing the spread and impacts of non-native species within BC. I am joining you today from Kamloops, where I am grateful to live, work, and learn on the unceded traditional territory of the Secwepemc. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, co-hosted by the Integrative Vegetation Management Association of British Columbia and the ISCBC. It is entitled Selective Management of Multiple Invasive Aquatic Plants in BC using ProcellaCOR FX Aquatic Herbicide. This webinar is approved in BC for one continuing education credit towards pesticide applicator certification. To qualify for the credit, you must participate in the entire webinar, including the quiz at the end. The quiz link will be added in the chat box immediately following the presentation, and it will remain open from that time on. You will be reminded again at that time to complete it as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ISCBC's Learning Center later this month, as well, so everyone will have the opportunity to earn their CEC credits. If you want to watch this and not necessarily for getting the credits, it will also be available on our YouTube channel. The quiz must be completed in the Learning Center if you watch the recording, however. There will also be a link to our Learning Center in the chat, so you can access it at any time, which will be added later. If you have any questions about the credits, you can reach out to Gwen Shrimpton at IVMA. Now, I'm sure you're all Zoom experts by now, but if you are experiencing any technical problems with Zoom, please use the chat box and Mel, our tech support, will see if she can assist you. Also, everyone is muted as this is a webinar, so you should be able to hear myself and the presenters. In Zoom, you have the option to select speaker view or gallery view at the top of your screen. We recommend speaker view. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be answering those questions, time permitting. If you see your question already in the Q&A box, you can click the thumbs up button to upvote the question and bump it up the list. If we run out of time to address all of the questions, we will be sharing the questions and the answers by email later. So at this point, I am pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Gwen Shrimpton, Executive Director of the Integrative Vegetation Management Association of BC. So please enjoy the webinar, and over to you, Gwen.
Good morning. As Megan said, I'm Gwen Shrimpton. I'm the Executive Director of the Integrative Vegetation Management Association of British Columbia. And this webinar is co-hosted jointly by the IVMA and the ISC. The IVMA is a recognized organization dedicated to the responsible practice of vegetation management throughout the province. Our membership represents diverse industries, including forestry, gas and electric utilities, railways and highways, and invasive plant management. The IVMA is the credit coordinator for the Ministry of Environment Continuing Education Program for the recertification of pesticide applicators for forestry, industrial vegetation management, which includes noxious weeds and aerial categories. You must be a member of the IVMA for us to track your credits. Information on this program, as well as how to become a member of the IVMA, can be found on our website at ivma.com. We plan to enhance the opportunities for obtaining credits by holding these webinars. This webinar qualifies for one credit in British Columbia. You must provide us with your pesticide applicator certificate number when you register for this webinar and stay for the entire presentation and answer the quiz at the end. You don't need to pass the quiz, but you must answer the questions in order to obtain your credit. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this webinar, our speaker for this webinar, Dr. Mark Heilman. Dr. Mark is a trained aquatic ecologist with his PhD from the University of Notre Dame and over 30 years experience in the study and control of invasive and nuisance aquatic plants. He is a past president of the Aquatic Plant Management Society, the current director of the North American Invasive Species Management Association, and a certified lake manager. Dr. Heilman has led CPRO's research, development, and regulatory efforts for ProcellaCOR since its beginning in 2010. Welcome, Dr. Heilman.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Megan, Melanie, for the opportunity to present today. Since they signed off, I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Thank you as participants for joining the webinar, and I look forward to sharing an overview about ProcellaCOR. Yeah, let me share.
Looks good.
Okay, good. Thank you, Megan. Get this here. All right. So title of my presentation today is about the selective management of multiple invasive aquatic plants in British Columbia using a new aquatic herbicide, ProcellaCOR FX. Since 2018, my company, CPRO, has been engaged to develop and register this herbicide for use in Canada, and that was accomplished back in May of 2023. So my goal is to give an overview today of the herbicide, and then also present some information on a variety of different examples of its use, both in the United States and also now in Canada. Hopefully my presentation advances. It did. All right, so ProcellaCOR is CPRO's brand name for the aquatic use of the active ingredient fluoroperoxyfen benzyl. This is an herbicide that has been registered in the United States by US EPA under the US EPA Reduced Risk Program as an aquatic herbicide. And as I mentioned, it is now also registered in Canada. Health Canada had a variety of positive statements to make. It's Pest Management Regulatory Agency cited that this herbicide can provide provincial authorities and their partners a valuable tool and a long-term solution to manage invasive aquatic species, specifically aquatic invasive plants. Some of those plants are shown here in photos on the right. The most common target in British Columbia can be a Eurasian watermilfoil as a species for selective control. Other invasive watermilfoils such as parrotsfeather are also sensitive, and there is good activity and on the label in Canada for control of floating heart species such as yellow floating heart. There is one of the great properties of ProcellaCOR is it's highly selective in its activity. We have the good fortune to have an herbicide that has strong activity as an herbicide on some of these problem plants, but minimal activity on most desirable native aquatic plants that we find here in North America. It can have this herbicidal action and selectivity with just short exposure, meaning the amount of time that the water needs to be in contact with some of these target plants is relatively short, hours in some cases, up to a few days. And it's a systemic mode of action as an herbicide, so that it does move into the target vegetation and is translocated through the plant to provide full control of root systems with the proper exposure. As a herbicide, it's classified per the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee as a Group 4 herbicide, which is the group for auxin mimics. These are growth regulating herbicides that generally have more activity on dicot or broadleaf species and less on monocot, such as grasses, just as a general rule of thumb. ProcellaCOR does belong to a new chemical family in this group called the aeropicillinates, and these are highlighted by enhanced specificity and also very low use rates compared to some of our older members of the Group 4 herbicides. A quick review of ProcellaCOR's physical chemistry and environmental profile. In terms of its fate, or how does it behave in the aquatic environment, one of the most interesting characteristics is that it's taken up very quickly and strongly by target aquatic plants. It wants to be in the vegetation, in that biomass, and not in the water. And so published studies using radio-labeled herbicide have shown that this effect can happen in minutes and often results in a large quantity of herbicide in the target plants and a minimal fraction in the water. And you see those ratios in the published work cited here. 23 times just in 30 minutes, there's 23 times more in the plant tissue when you correct for biomass, et cetera, compared to the water. And then by 6 hours, it's even more amplified within the plant tissue. In terms of degradation, it's broken down rapidly via photolysis with a half-life frequently in the hours range, with shallower water. It's also broken down via hydrolysis, meaning a pH-dependent effect, where a part of the herbicide is split to form a weaker acid form of the herbicide. And then also microbial action, both aerobic and anaerobic mechanisms can break down the herbicide as well. From a toxicology perspective, one of the excellent strengths of the herbicide for use as an aquatic herbicide is its minimal or little toxicity noted in all the basic regulatory studies. In terms of mammalian toxicity, the absence of toxicity noted in those studies translates to no limits on swimming, fishing, or water consumption on the Canadian registered federal label. There's also a very favorable profile in terms of ecotoxicology, a lack of toxicity noted for fish, birds, and other aquatic fauna. It does have activity on some non-target plants. It is an herbicide. This can translate in a terrestrial setting in the use of water immediately following application. There's label guidelines on what is an appropriate use for irrigation. And there also is limited activity, even though it's very selective. There is some activity on some non-target aquatic plants, which I'll reference here a little bit more in a minute. So again, going back to conclusions from Health Canada, again, very favorable. The active ingredient and its transformation products do not pose a risk to wild mammals, birds, invertebrates, earthworms, bees, aquatic invertebrates, fish, etc. So very favorable there. The use as a tool, it certainly is an herbicide, so there are some sensitive non-target terrestrial and aquatic plants. But there's a recognition that there is a need when controlling invasive species to take on a little bit of that risk to help protect habitat for native species. And that's one of the great strengths of ProcellaCOR as an aquatic herbicide, is restoring habitat and promoting native aquatic plants following treatment of the invasive plants. And ultimately, PMRA recognizes that as well, as indicating the herbicide will have the desired effect of controlling invasive aquatic plants specifically, and that pose a risk to sensitive habitats. So overall, ecologically, a very favorable tool in the characterization and risk assessment that PMRA and also multiple other international regulatory agencies have concluded. There is a great deal of published science around ProcellaCOR. We began work with the herbicide all the way back in 2010, as was referenced. We have worked with university and government partners, primarily in the United States, to evaluate the herbicide and to publish information about it in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So there's a number of publications out there on its spectrum of control and activity, its behavior in different settings, different exposure scenarios and use rate scenarios that are indicative of use patterns in the field, and also scaling up those trials into large mesocosm, larger tank studies, as well as field demonstrations, and then some specialized ecotoxicology that's been published, including work on freshwater mussels and some pending publication of work on salmon. Just an example of the selective control documented in some of those initial studies. This is a large mesocosm tank study about 6,000, 7,000 liters or so. And this was done in cooperation with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Aquatic Plant Control Research Program down in Texas in the early spring there a few years back. And you can see the untreated tanks, healthy populations, in this case of a perennial Eurasian watermilfoil, as well as a hybrid. The hybrid Eurasian watermilfoil is generally crossed the Eurasian with northern watermilfoil or Myriophyllum spicatum. So we have a cross between Myriophyllum spicatum and Myriophyllum sibiricum, between the northern and the Eurasian. This work just showed that with turnover, these tanks can have water exchange through them, and there were different water exchange scenarios evaluated. In this particular case, 9 prescription dose units of ProcellaCOR FX, which I'll get into the PDU here in a second as a unit. But that rate per hectare meter of water with 24-hour turnover led to very effective and selective control of the 2 varieties of Eurasian watermilfoil, but also provided good selectivity to native aquatic plants, in this case, plants like tape grass, Canadian waterweed or Elodea, as well as a few pondweed species. So I mentioned the prescription dose units of FX just to calibrate on what the low amounts those represent. A single prescription dose unit of that formulation is just 33.3 milliliters. So this rate of 9 PDU that provided selective effective control in a hectare meter equivalent of water. If that's 2 meters of water, that would require just 0.6 liters of the formulated herbicide on a per hectare basis. So very active, very low use rates in the aquatic environment. So with that, I'll shift gears and I'll talk about some representative management outcomes, seeing some of the science translated into field operations. Literally across the United States, there's been tens of thousands of sites across from north to south, east to west that have been had successful management with ProcellaCOR since its US EPA registration in 2018. We did have the opportunity during the pandemic, which was its own story, but in 2021 and 2022, Health Canada allowed us a research authorization at the federal level to evaluate and demonstrate ProcellaCOR in select sites in Canada. We did get some limited work out in BC as well as in Ontario, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well as the transition into some operational management that's occurred since. I'm going to highlight 3 species relevant to BC, a little bit of info on parrotsfeather, a couple of examples of control of yellow floating heart, and then examples of selective control of Eurasian watermilfoil at a variety of scales. This is from the Western U.S., an example of control in a research demonstration on parrotsfeather. This is a treatment 2 days into the treatment. This is an in-water targeted treatment. ProcellaCOR can be used for foliar treatment of the emerged part of parrotsfeather, which is common in shallow water. But in this case, it was an in-water targeted treatment, which generally is a little slower, but also generally more thorough, especially if you can treat a majority of the aquatic site that's infested. So in-water treatment here, you can see just 2 days after treatment, what's happened is the emerged part of the parrotfeather plant has extended, has responded to the growth-regulating herbicide, leading to a kind of a disrupted and enhanced growth, which is compromising the vascular tissue of the plants. That's part of the mode of action of the herbicide, is that disrupted growth compromises vascular tissue, which prevents sensitive plants from transporting sugars and substances within their tissues, and that leads to a gradual death. So fast uptake, kind of an intermediate speed of control. In this case, the in-water treatment, 2 days in, you can see symptoms, but on the outside, where the water the first exposure occurred around these patches and bled into them. And you can see the differences in response. You can see that still 11 days after treatment, but the outer edges are definitely showing a strong response, starting to die back. And then by about 6 weeks after treatment, all there's left is a native American pondweed, which is kind of in these same areas, but overgrown by the parrot's feather. And that was able to, the pondweed, the desirable pondweed species persisted after the control of the parrot's feather in this particular field site. So again, selective control, an invasive aquatic plant, in this case, parrot's feather. Another interesting example is control of yellow floating heart. This is down in the central U.S. in Oklahoma. This is Lake Carl Blackwell, which is a drinking water reservoir that provides water to the city of Stillwater, which is where Oklahoma State University is located. We cooperated with the university, who the university actually has oversight of the reservoir and its use. And we worked with the university as well as with their researchers in freshwater ecology and limnology that were also at the university to develop a plan to control an initial infestation of yellow floating heart that had been detected in the drinking water reservoir. The intake was at the far eastern or right side of the reservoir in the photo to the left. And thankfully that was somewhat removed from where the yellow floating heart showed up. But in-water treatments were done in some of these infested coves to try to selectively control this target plant in the drinking system and prevent its further spread. So the images on the right show some satellite and aerial photography of the initial 2019 treatment leading up the growth of the plant leading up to treatment, which occurred in early July of that year. You can see the initial growth in the spring expanding into the late spring and early summer. The initial treatment in early July, there was a great deal of yellow floating heart in the system, but within 2 to 3 weeks after treatment, there was good control achieved in the areas that were treated. And I'll show a series of photos, a time series showing some of that response at 2 days after treatment. In this photo, one of the infested coves that was managed, pretty minimal response with the in-water treatment, very kind of subtle responses and symptoms, not really seen at scale. But within a week to 2 weeks, there was a dramatic change in the health of the yellow floating heart. It transitions from early chlorosis or yellowing of the plant into death and browning and necrosis or dying tissue in the plant. And then within a few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks out, you start to see a dramatic level of control achieved of the yellow floating heart, such that by around a month, there is very good control of the plant. Partners at Oklahoma State University, and this is a published paper now, also looked at some water quality trends, especially with respect to oxygen in some of the treatment areas. This is an example of one of the coves where a series of stations from the outside part of the cove, station 1, down deep into the infested area of the cove, in the shallower water. They monitored dissolved oxygen as well as biological oxygen demand and a few other parameters. What they noticed is in the more open areas, less dominated by yellow floating heart, a little bit deeper, oxygen was maintained at a 6 to 8 part per million level. Throughout treatment, around site 4, there was a beginning of a transition, especially at sites 5 through 7. Before treatment, the yellow floating heart was limiting diffusion of oxygen and resulting in lower dissolved oxygen in the about 2 to 4 ppm range prior to treatment. Right after treatment, within a few days, they pick up a little bit of a signal of a decline as the plants begin to show some stress. But within 10 days and beyond, you see a restoration of dissolved oxygen concentrations with control of the yellow floating heart. So a site that had limited dissolved oxygen, relatively poor habitat as a result, was improved by the selective control using the ProcellaCOR. And the arrows just show those trends. This work on yellow floating heart, there is interest throughout Canada in dealing with yellow floating heart, which is a problem in multiple provinces. One of the places we've had interest is over in Nova Scotia with a incipient infestation of yellow floating heart in a small lake site called Little Albro Lake. This site first detected, or there was a first introduction identified in around 2006. It really got on the radar of the province and the local authorities in 2009. And since that time, there's been a variety of management strategies and some research in terms of integrated control strategies up until just a few years ago. There's a picture here in the lower left of benthic mats that were put down for the yellow floating heart, which had limited results. The gentleman on the right waiting in the yellow floating heart is actually a local city official who was basically running on the issue of yellow floating heart in this site and followed it closely throughout and shepherded it through a lot of processes along with the agency people involved at both the provincial, federal, and the local level. There's a web link here. You can look this up if you want more information about the situation there. But they eventually, starting in about 2022, started to show real interest in the potential to use ProcellaCOR. They became aware of its pending registration status. And this is just satellite imagery showing the location relative to downtown Halifax. The lake is up in the, north of that golf course. There's a larger lake, and then you see it zoomed in, the Little Albro versus the larger Albro to the lake to the north. Little Albro with a significant infestation in imagery. This is actually up-to-date drone footage looking from west to east across the lake just on the day of application this year. Heavily infested. They did work through a lot of processes, provincial and federal approvals and permitting to be able to treat this site this year in the early fall, very early fall. And here's some images on the water from the south shore of the lake showing the transition in symptoms. Fairly similar, a little bit slower than the example from Oklahoma. Cooler water with a late season start, but you see it 1 week after treatment, subtle symptoms, definitely more visible at 2 weeks after treatment. 3 weeks in, you're starting to see dieback and sinking of the plants. And then at a month, definitely plants have sunk below the surface and there's minimal healthy biomass. It may bring up, this is actually satellite through Sentinel satellite, showing the same progression of injury. You see Little Albro in the lower center part of the photo below the larger lake. And at 2 weeks after treatment, just as the earlier photo showed, there's strong injury, browning, and injury to the yellow floating heart, which by about a month, plants are sinking out off the surface and indicating control. Obviously, there's a bit of this is just before seasonal senescence, and we were aware of that. This earlier timing would have been ideal, but there was still a window here to treat when they finally got through all the other processes. So you can see in October 2022, similar timing as the year of treatment photo at 1 month after treatment. You see there's still green, healthy yellow floating heart in that untreated situation. So there wasn't a seasonal senescence occurring yet. It occurs there a few weeks later than that. So with that, I'll transition into some examples of Eurasian watermilfoil control. I'll start with kind of different scales, talking about large partial treatments that are almost lake-wide in their operational use. One good example of this is in Minerva Lake in New York State, here in the US. A small partial treatment example under our research authorization. In 2022, we were late in the season able to do a small treatment area in Silvermere Lake in BC near Mission. And then I'll talk about a couple other interesting treatments. Lake George in New York, some spot treatments there implemented by the state of New York. And then Farlane Lake, which is a small lake north of Toronto in Ontario that's been a very successful selective control effort. So the first of these examples, Minerva Lake. This is in the Adirondack Mountains that are in the Adirondack Park, overseen by the APA, the state agency that oversees the park. The Eurasian watermilfoil was found in 2007 in this lake, and it was managed with aggressive hand harvesting and diver-assisted suction harvesting for a number of years. And towards the late 2010s, the scale of that was requiring 400 to 500 hours of diver work annually just to try to stay ahead of the problem and provide a little bit of relief. It was basically becoming too much, so the town of Minerva Lake organized the opportunity and sought a permit to use ProcellaCOR in 2020 to control the Eurasian watermilfoil and scale and to sort of reset the system so that diver efforts could integrate back in and be efficient to maintain control. And this is the Minerva Lake's, it's a relatively small lake overall, 32 hectares total. A little over half the lake was treated, the areas in the purple on the right. An equivalent, the use rates here about 4 PDU FX per hectare meter, translated to just 3 liters of product over the 17 hectares. The lake had about 66% frequency of occurrence of Eurasian watermilfoil in the late summer of 2019, prior to treatment the following spring. And ProcellaCOR after treatment dissipated quickly below 1 part per billion active ingredient by 24 hours post-treatment. This is the frequency of occurrence tables pulled out for individual reports through 14 months after treatment. The summer prior to treatment, you see the 66% Eurasian frequency of occurrence. In the early August of 2020, 2 months after ProcellaCOR treatment, Eurasian watermilfoil cannot be detected in this rake survey of frequency, and it was not found at all during that summer after control. The next summer, 14 months after treatment, August 11th of 2021, Eurasian watermilfoil was still not detectable in the lake. It was only in late 2022 that a few trace finds of the plant were found. And there has been, since that time, a low-level hand pulling has been able to keep up with maintenance control of the milfoil. The other takeaway from these tables is a very healthy native aquatic plant community. You see a large number of species, native pondweeds, naiads, just a number of desirable habitat species that were not affected by the treatment and promoted in terms of their abundance after the control of the Eurasian watermilfoil. With that, I'll transition into a few examples about research as well as early operational use in Canada. I referenced our research authorization we had for a couple years, and then the registration in 2023. In September 2023, we had the first operational applications of the fully registered ProcellaCOR FX in Ontario. So in BC, the first treatment of Eurasian watermilfoil was in Silvermere Lake on the southeast shore, a 5-hectare area of the lake, which is about 110 hectares or so in size, if I recall. That was done in late September, end of season treatment, once all the processes were done to allow that effort. There was lots of discussion on an approach to this, very unique to do a research authorization in a site that did not require a provincial permit along with the federal research authorization. But there was a lot of permissions as well as consultation with Kwantlen First Nations in this case, to allow it to move forward. And I'd like to acknowledge Becky Brown with the province for her efforts in facilitating those interactions. Application was done in late September. The rates 5 PDU of FX per hectare meter. Again, very low quantity of the herbicide was used to treat the 5 hectares. This shows a simple presence-absence grid for Eurasian watermilfoil in the early September of 2022, a few weeks prior to the treatment. I see a very common distribution of Eurasian watermilfoil, both in the treatment area and in the lake at large. By early June 2023, the treatment area had limited Eurasian watermilfoil. Basically, none was detected in the treatment area and immediately around it in most cases. But there was still significant Eurasian watermilfoil present in other areas, as we would have expected from a late season localized treatment like this. This is drone imagery of the lake in early June in untreated areas with the orange arrow or the yellow arrows are showing in the small satellite image. Eurasian watermilfoil coming on and growing in the early spring or late spring period. And then in the ProcellaCOR 5-hectare treatment area, again, no Eurasian watermilfoil detected, and that was also reflected in the drone imagery. There was interest in this case in the province. The Western painted turtle is a threatened provincially listed species. There was monitoring done, some cooperation with provincial wildlife groups and agencies to look at this and say we need to check it, even though there wasn't a high expectation of any impact to the turtle. We did monitor for it and did detect it after in the spring following the initial treatment. So good news there. I'll switch back from Canada briefly to Lake George and spot treatment that was done there this year. Lake George is considered one of the most beautiful lakes in North America. It's called the Queen of American Lakes as one nickname, and up in the Adirondack Park as well. It has a whole agency, the Lake George Park Commission, that's responsible for its overall management and oversight. The Park Commission implemented demonstration treatments of ProcellaCOR in 2024, and this was to evaluate it as a potential complementary tool as part of their overall integrated strategy for control of Eurasian watermilfoil, along with their diver-assisted suction harvesting, which had been an extensive effort to the point of the harvesting was having trouble keeping up overall with some of the areas that were infested. A very successful program overall, but being strained by the distribution of Eurasian watermilfoil in the lake. There was quite a bit of public debate around this treatment, and if you look online, you can see that. But these areas were treated in late June. 2 1.6 hectare or 4-acre treatment areas were treated in late June. Some photos around some of the treatment in comparison to untreated areas. This is an area that was not treated as part of the demonstrations, Sunset Bay. And this is 9 days after the application was done in early July when this photo was taken. These plants are healthy at the surface, as you would expect, vigorous Eurasian watermilfoil. This is in one of the treatment sites, Blair's Bay. 9 days after application, there's excellent impact to Eurasian watermilfoil. It's still dying at this point, but you start to see some natives that are isolated within these dense patches that are healthy and growing out of it. Some of the areas that were in the treatment area were less infested by Eurasian watermilfoil, and they looked excellent overall. This is a great photo of a variety of pondweeds and Valsinaria species present in the treatment area. 46 days after treatment, this is again going back to the untreated site, about 3 meters of water and plants approaching the surface, and looking very healthy, doing quite well. That's not the case of the demonstration areas. Both had very excellent control. Blair's Bay, this is an area you can see the remnant Eurasian watermilfoil biomass dead on the bottom, in the foreground with native healthy native aquatic plants in the background, largely pondweed and others. This is a table, again, another photo of Blair's Bay at 46 days after treatment. Healthy native pondweed species primarily in that photo. And then on the left is a independent third-party consultant aquatic plant assessment and a table of frequency of some of the different aquatic plants, in this case, the Blair's Bay demonstration area. And the table shows 29 native submerged plant species were detected in that survey, which was done at 51 days after treatment. And again, Eurasian watermilfoil was found at trace amounts in a quadrant of the treatment area, but overall excellent control compared to an area that used to be more dominated by Eurasian watermilfoil. The last example I'll run through is Far Lane Lake in Ontario. This is, again, a 100+ hectare system a couple hours north of Toronto. Eurasian watermilfoil was first detected in this lake in 2012. I will say a small group here at Far Lane Lake Community Association did tremendous work to try to every tool and technique available to them to control Eurasian watermilfoil. Honestly, one of the most impressive private group efforts that I've seen in all my career. But they did bottom barriers, diver removal, spot contract treatment with the only other registered in-water herbicide, dicot or reward. Eurasian watermilfoil, it still remained, still was gradually spreading. A lot of small patches were scattered in different parts of the lake. And so they worked very hard. They reached out to me in like 2021, the early parts of our research authorization. They were interested to see if they could be part of that research program. It didn't work out, but by the time 2023 rolled around, the product was registered. They were ready to go, sought out the appropriate federal and provincial permits, and implemented a treatment of 15 spot infestations that they had mapped out and detected entering that treatment. About 2.5 total hectares were treated at a wide range of rates on the higher side for these very small spots in early September of 2023. They started to see early collapse of the Eurasian watermilfoil in just within a week or so after that. This is photos of the day of treatment, a condition of healthy milfoil near shore in one of the areas on the western shore of the lake. And this was the first application of the fully registered ProcellaCOR FX in Canada. It was a submerged treatment done from an airboat with drop hoses. There were variety of both native plants there as well as Eurasian watermilfoil, but Eurasian definitely was dominant. This was taken with an underwater camera off now the current association president's dock. And you can see what they were dealing with right at the surface, dense Eurasian watermilfoil and about 1.5 meters, 2 meters of water. And this is 1 week after treatment, still had Eurasian watermilfoil at the surface, but yellowing, twisting. The ProcellaCOR is working initially on the leaf nodes and the apical parts of the plant, causing a swelling at each of the leaf nodes, and then basically a compromise of that vascular system of the plant, and then gradual increased injury and death of the plant. So this is 1 week. At 2 weeks, those plants were browned out and sinking off the surface to the bottom. You can begin to actually see the bottom. And this is 3 weeks after the treatment. Again, just the dying Eurasian watermilfoil as a monoculture on the bottom. And then I was able to go out there with the group and do an initial survey in early October, about a month after treatment. And you can definitely see just what we've seen in countless U.S. sites. High impact to Eurasian watermilfoil several weeks after treatment compared to the untreated photo on the right. Low to no impact on the native aquatic plants, basically very healthy. 6 were found, some pondweeds, naiad, chara, and valsinaria or tape grass. You could see remnant pieces of the old burlap mat they put down as bottom barrier, along with the dead milfoil in some of the areas. But overall, a very selective treatment as was hoped for. And that treatment has held up very well. Throughout the entire 2024 season. No viable Eurasian watermilfoil is detected. There's a little bit of trace dead biomass at the beginning. No other plants were found throughout the rest of the summer, with multiple survey efforts and intensive looks by the association and others. So overall, looking very good. in terms of longevity of control. So with that, I'll wrap up. ProcellaCOR FX is an aquatic herbicide. CPRO, we've had a great opportunity, and thanks to many partners up there for the opportunity to collaborate in the registration and development of the herbicide. It does represent a new selective tool for control of Eurasian watermilfoil and several other problem invasive aquatic plants in BC. We have a series of videos, mainly US focused, but we do have one on the Far Lane Lake experience on our website. You can see the links here, and the QR code will go to the Far Lane Lake video as well. If any here are interested in reviewing those, you can find them relatively easy and view those. There's just a number of different management outcomes focused on the needs of the stakeholder and helping restore impaired lakes. And with that, contact information for myself. I'll also point out my colleague, Jeremy. Jeremy's our business lead in Canada, and you might have some relevant questions for him. And so his contact information is here as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Heilman, for your really detailed presentation. It was very informative and really quite interesting. So now, everyone, we will begin the Q&A. We will start with the first questions as they appear and work our way through until we reach about 10 a.m. As mentioned, if there is not enough time to address all of the questions, we will put out the answers by email at a later date. If you see your question already being asked in that Q&A box, you can click the thumbs up to bring it up to the list. Also, the quiz is now open, and so again, you must complete the quiz to gain your continuing education credit. The link is now in the chat box to access the quiz, so please ensure that you do complete that. For the Q&A, Dr. Heilman, do you want to read the Q&A yourself, or I'm able to read it out to you, whichever is easier?
I've got the window open. So
Perfect.
as long as it's a manageable number of questions, I'll just go through them in order.
Sounds good.
If it gets to be a lot, I'll let you moderate to some level as well. So there's been a couple questions on temperature range for use of ProcellaCOR, and also is there impact on dissolved oxygen with plant decomposition at the bottom. So on temperature range, for sensitive invasive plants, such as the ones I talked about today, it's really focused on active growth. If these plants are actively growing and metabolizing, they should have sensitivity. Generally, the more active, kind of in the sweet spot for their optimal growth, the more responsive they'll be, the more efficient the herbicide exposure will be to ProcellaCOR. So there may be an optimal range, but as long as the plants are growing and actively metabolizing, there's pretty good room on the cooler ends of both in the spring and then the fall or the early fall. I wouldn't go too deep into the fall. That's when you start to get plant senescence, which may limit the response to the herbicide. On dissolved oxygen, certainly we are impacting, especially with later season treatment and warmer water. There is biomass there, a lot of biomass in some cases for these monoculture of invasive plants. ProcellaCOR is taken up very quickly. The response is intermediate, which is good for maintaining dissolved oxygen and overall water quality, but you still can be controlling a large quantity of biomass there, and that will stimulate a bacterial community that's degrading that dying biomass, and that can influence and impact and reduce dissolved oxygen in a worst case. The ways to avoid it are simply treating early, cooler water, not allow it to reach its full growth range, as long as permitting and other processes allow that little bit earlier stage of active growth. And obviously, there's also the ability to treat sections of the plants potentially if it's a large infestation that can minimize the response. But overall, we have seen very little signs of impact to dissolved oxygen. Overall, the speed of control is gradual enough that there's pretty low risk of that issue. consult with us specifically on treatment recommendations as needed. But overall, we've seen restoration of available oxygen rather than a lot of declines after treatment. Let's see. Now the questions are coming. I'll keep going. ProcellaCOR FX seed bank. Seed bank, no. Seed bank generally in the sediments, away from exposure to the herbicide. If the seeds are being formed as the plants are exposed, there might be a chance of some carryover in the seeds themselves, but it's a low chance. So overall, the answer is no. Seedbed's not impacted, so there will be a seed bank of invasive plant propagules for some of these species that can cause or create the opportunity for reinfestation later. In an eradication effort, that becomes more relevant. In a control effort, most of these plants are vegetatively propagated, so the seed bank is less of an issue, but still could be a long-term mechanism for reinfestation. The average prescription dose units of FX per hectare, that's obviously driven somewhat by water depth and species, but for Eurasian watermilfoil example, the common rate range is probably in a 4 to 8 PDU per hectare meter of water. So again, that's the equivalent of part per billion active ingredients, so very low quantities in the 4 to 8 ppb AI range, very low quantities of herbicide. Cost, I'd say contact us directly about costing questions. Reach out to my colleague Jeremy. He can describe how the product's being made available in Canada and talk about some of the costing around treatments. Worked on biomass effects. Let's see. I think I kind of, outside of oxygen. Again, biomass, there's a natural senescence of biomass that occurs in the fall for most of these species anyway. So I think the ideal thing, yes, biomass provides nutrients along with dissolved oxygen and can release some phosphorus and nitrogen into the water that under productive conditions can stimulate some growth of algae that may or may not be problematic. Most of the time, what we see is a lot of native aquatic plants in a mixed species setting. Those plants are unaffected and they can take up a lot of the nutrients that are released by dying invasive biomass. So hopefully I've addressed that question. And yes, native plants that are impacted, I probably didn't touch on that enough. So overall, you can see from some of the tables, there's many species that are not affected. There are some aquatic dicot plants that have some sensitivity, and you'll see various levels of symptoms on those. The most relevant would be native Myriophyllum species, such as northern watermilfoil. They have similar sensitivity as Eurasian watermilfoil. So when you treat Eurasian watermilfoil, you generally will have strong impact on your native watermilfoils if they're present. The other native plants that might be influenced, again, are more in the dicot category. The broadleaves, Biden's Beckii has a little sensitivity. Coontail ceratophyllum on the U.S., it's on the U.S. label for higher rate treatments, but in Eurasian watermilfoil treatments, you'll see some symptoms, but those generally only last 4 to 6 weeks. Buttercup or crowfoot has some sensitivity as a diquat, but most of these sensitivities are an order of magnitude different than Eurasian watermilfoil, so there is an opportunity for selectivity with most of these species. Lilies around the shoreline, water lily can be considered invasive in certain parts of Canada. It can show sensitivity. Not on the label, but you'll see some symptoms and maybe some reduction or thinning of water lilies depending on rate and location relative to the treatment area. Water shield, that would be one that is a species-sensitive ProcellaCOR labeled in the U.S. do not recall off the top of my head on the Canadian side, but it is very sensitive. So it can be controlled by ProcellaCOR treatment, and relative to non-target plant response, it will show sensitivity and be reduced after treatment. Let's see, water clarity and depth. Yes, clarity of water can enhance breakdown. Water depth can reduce the UV light penetration in the water column relative to the overall volume of water. So that can lead to slower degradation after treatment. A lot of the degradation in a submerged plant setting is actually occurring in and around the plants themselves. There's a high absorption into plants. So it's a pretty complex environmental fate, but overall, lots of mechanisms working to reduce the persistence of the herbicide and limit its exposure generally to hours to a few days. And hopefully I got those two. Let's see, Seymour Lake. Lots of yellow floating heart. Drinking water quality. Concerns reasonable. Again, I'll point out the decisions from US EPA with no drinking water restrictions in its reviews. Also Health Canada, no drinking restrictions for use of ProcellaCOR. So I will point you to the agencies that are making these decisions. Again, the data suggests risk is basically negligible in terms of different routes of human exposure. But again, the decisions by the agencies really reflect and support that. And again, if anyone has questions on any of this, they're welcome to reach out. Yellow flag iris. Limited work done on yellow flag iris. We see more activity in foliar treatments done in earlier stages of growth. It's not on the label, so obviously that's the big caveat. It cannot be used directly for yellow flag iris control. And I would say kind of mixed results in some things we've seen in the U.S. and other indirect studies, some small studies we've done. More sensitivity to foliar exposure than to in-water exposure for that emerged invasive plant. Let's see, communities law and negative response towards ProcellaCOR. What made things change? Yes, herbicide use in Canada overall, it's limited compared to the U.S. Looking at it historically, a lot less of it. There's less familiarity with the processes to review and permit these tools. There is a lot of education and outreach that goes on. We certainly want to foster more information about how this whole process looks, the data, and the overall conclusions relative to environmental and human health risk assessment. So yes, you take some time to overcome a negative initial response to the idea of using an aquatic herbicide in water. But with the right persistence and the right information, generally folks who are open-minded and looking at it objectively come to different conclusions than maybe their initial response. But again, just a lot goes into that. We just want to have great communications about it and let the facts and the science behind the tool basically be the driver of conclusions on whether or not to use it as a tool for invasive plant management. ProcellaCOR near wetlands, and we're down to a minute. Let's see. I want to make sure if there's like one that is like overarching. Okay. I was wondering if my quiz questions would totally match up with my presentation. If not, well, you're not being graded. You just participate. Look at the label. If you want the label, we can provide that. And there's a whole separate training that we do around use of the herbicide and a certification process. Not effective against common pondweed species. Areas of yellow floating heart were mapped satellite and also via drone. And then ProcellaCOR around wetlands and stream outputs that affect salmonids. Again, there is interest in that question. We've done initial work with federal and university partners on salmon. We see little response to the herbicide, which is great. Basically, no effects. But there's questions there. So wetland response, that's dictated by different types of vegetation that are in that wetland. Stream outputs that are directly around a lot of salmonid different life stages. Again, we see in the data little risk. That's something that can be described, and we can provide both reports as well as hopefully a pending published paper here in the near term to help address those questions. And with that, I'm a little over.
All good. We're right on time. It's great. So thank you so much again, Dr. Heilman, for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you, Gwen, with the IVMA and everyone that's attended today. We will be sending out a link with a short survey to all participants afterwards. We encourage you to please fill it out so we can get your feedback and ideas for future webinars. Just a quick reminder to make sure that you have completed the quiz to get your continuing education credit. And thank you for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your day.